The bank said a woman could not sign a cattle loan. She brought the herd as collateral. The banker's name was Gideon Holt. He sat behind a desk made of walnut, and he wore a vest made of wool, and he said no, with the ease of a man who said no often, the ease, the practice, the profession, because a banker's profession is saying no to people who need money, and the needing money was the vulnerability, and the vulnerability was the leverage, and the leverage was the desk, and the desk was between Gideon Holt and Marit Sundersen, and the desk was the wall. A woman cannot sign a cattle loan, Gideon said. He said it with the authority of a man who believed that authority resided in his position, and that his position was the final word. And the final word was no. And no was what he said to Marit Sundersen on a Tuesday morning in March, in the Cattlemen's Bank of Ashton, Colorado territory. Marit was 29 years old. She was Norwegian, born in Norway, raised in Minnesota, moved to Colorado at 22, with a husband named Eric, who had died of a rattlesnake bite in the summer of her 3rd year on the ranch. The dying sudden and absurd in the way that rattlesnake deaths are sudden and absurd. A man walking to the barn. A snake in the grass. A bite on the ankle. And the ankle swelling, and the swelling spreading, and the spreading killing, and the killing taking 4 hours. 4 hours that Marit spent holding Eric's hand, while the venom did what venom does, which is destroy. She had run the ranch alone for 4 years after Eric's death. 4 years of a woman running a cattle ranch in the Colorado territory, running it with the competence that Eric had recognized in her when they were still in Minnesota. The competence that had made him say, "You should learn this, you should learn all of this," because a ranch requires 2 people who can do everything. And 2 people who can do everything is the insurance against the thing that happened, which was the rattlesnake, and the insurance was the competence, and the competence was the survival. The ranch was 600 acres of grassland and pine in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The ranch had 80 head of cattle. The 80 head needed to become 150 head, because 150 head was the number that made the ranch profitable, and 80 was the number that made the ranch survivable, and the difference between survivable and profitable was the loan, and the loan was the thing that Gideon Holt had refused because Marit was a woman, and women could not sign cattle loans. "The law does not prohibit a woman from signing a loan," Marit said. She said it calmly, with the calm of a woman who had researched the law before entering the bank, because research is the preparation that competent people do before entering a negotiation. And Marit was competent, and competence includes preparation. "The law does not prohibit it. The bank's policy prohibits it. The policy is my policy. My policy is the bank. Your policy is not the law. Your policy is your preference. Your preference is based on the belief that a woman cannot manage a cattle operation, and the belief is incorrect. And the incorrectness is demonstrated by the fact that I have managed a cattle operation for 4 years without assistance, and without default, and without loss. And the withoutness is the evidence, and the evidence contradicts your belief. The evidence is irrelevant. The policy is the policy." Marit stood. She stood with the controlled deliberateness of a woman who is not angry, but determined. And the difference between angry and determined is the difference between heat and direction. Anger is heat without direction, and determination is direction without heat. And Marit's direction was the door, and the door was not a retreat but a pivot, because pivots are what competent people do when the frontal approach fails. She walked out of the bank into the March sunlight and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. The breathing was the anger being released, the anger that she had kept contained during the meeting, because contained anger is more effective than expressed anger, the way contained water is more powerful than spilled water, and power was the thing she needed, and power required strategy, and strategy required calm, and calm was what she maintained while the anger circulated beneath it like current beneath ice. She thought of Eric. She thought of him the way she thought of him at every important moment, which was with the consultation of the dead. The consultation that says, "What would you do?" And what Eric would do was clear, because Eric had been a practical man. A man who solved problems by changing the terms of the problem rather than by arguing within the terms. And the changing the terms was the Norwegian pragmatism, the pragmatism of people who farm in countries where the sun disappears for months, and who learn that arguing with darkness is futile, and that finding light is the work. She went to see Orrin Blackwell. Orrin was a cattle buyer, 42 years old, weathered, honest in the way that cattle buyers must be honest, because the cattle business runs on handshakes, and handshakes require trust, and trust requires honesty, and Orrin was honest. He had bought cattle from Eric, and he had continued buying cattle from Marit after Eric died, and the continuing was the evidence of his assessment, and his assessment was that Marit Sundersen knew cattle. "Holt refused me," Marit said. She said it at Orrin's office, which was a room in the stockyard with a desk that was less grand than Gideon Holt's desk, and a man behind it who was more useful. Holt is a fool. Holt refuses women, because Holt believes that banking is the profession of men, and that the profession of men extends to the clients of the profession, and the extending is the prejudice, and prejudice is the fool's substitute for judgment. "I need 70 head. 70 head at $12 a head is $840. I have 200 in savings. I need a loan of $640. The loan would be secured by the existing herd and the land. The security is sufficient. The security exceeds the loan. The exceeding is the math, and the math does not care about gender. The math does not care about gender. Holt cares about gender. The solution is to bypass Holt. How? Bring the herd. Bring the herd to town. Bring 80 head of cattle down the main street of Ashton and park them in front of the Cattlemen's bank, and let the herd be the argument. Because the argument that Holt cannot refuse is the argument that stands in front of his bank, and that every person in town can see, and seeing is believing, and believing is the thing that Holt needs to do." Marit considered. The considering was brief, because the considering was the assessment, and the assessment was clear. The frontal approach had failed, the pivot was required, and the pivot was the herd, and the herd was the evidence, and evidence is the thing that overcomes policy, because policy is the preference of one man, and evidence is the fact of the world, and the fact of the world is more powerful than the preference of one man. She drove the herd. She drove 80 head of mixed cattle down from the foothills and into the valley, and along the road and into Ashton, Colorado territory, on a Saturday morning in March. The Saturday chosen because Saturday was the day the town was full, and a full town was the audience, and an audience was the pressure, and pressure was the mechanism. She woke before dawn on Saturday. She woke, and she dressed, and she saddled her horse, and she rode to the pasture where the 80 head were grazing, and the grazing was the peace that precedes the disruption, because what she was about to do was a disruption. The disruption of a town's Saturday morning and a banker's sense of authority, and the general assumption that cattle belong in pastures and not on Main Street, and the disruption was deliberate, and deliberate disruption is the tool of people who have been denied access by the normal channels. She drove the herd alone. She drove it alone because alone was the point. The point being that a woman who can drive 80 head of cattle 7 miles down a mountain road and through a town without losing a single head is a woman who can manage a cattle operation. And managing a cattle operation is the qualification for a cattle loan. And the qualification was being demonstrated in real time on the main street of Ashton. The herd came down Main Street at 9 in the morning. 80 head of cattle on a street that was designed for horses and wagons. The cattle filling the street the way water fills a channel, flowing between the boardwalks and the buildings. The flow controlled by Marit on horseback at the flank. Her horse moving with the precision of a horse that has worked cattle for years. The precision the evidence of skill, and the skill was visible to everyone in town, and everyone in town was watching, because 80 head of cattle on Main Street is the kind of thing that makes everyone in town watch. Gideon Holt came out of the bank. He came out because the cattle were in front of the bank, and 80 head of cattle in front of a bank is not a thing a banker can ignore, and ignoring was what Gideon wanted to do, and not ignoring was what the cattle required, and the requiring was the pressure, and the pressure was working. "What is this?" Gideon said. He said it standing on the boardwalk in front of the Cattlemen's bank, looking at 80 head of cattle and a woman on a horse, and the entire town watching. "This is my collateral," Marit said. She said it from the saddle, looking down at Gideon, the way a person on a horse looks down at a person on a boardwalk, which is from a position of elevation, and elevation is the advantage, and the advantage was Marit's. You said a woman cannot sign a cattle loan. I have brought you the reason a woman can sign a cattle loan. The reason is 80 head of cattle that I have managed for 4 years, and that I drove 7 miles this morning without assistance. The without assistance is the competence. The competence is the qualification. The qualification is standing in front of your bank. The town watched. The town watched the way towns watch, with the attention of people who understand that they are witnessing a moment that will become a story, and the story will be told at supper tables and at the general store and at the saloon, and the story will be, the woman brought the herd to the bank, and the bringing was the argument, and the argument was undeniable. Orrin Blackwell was watching too. He was watching from the stockyard gate with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was not a smile, but the suppression of a smile. The suppression, the restraint of a man who knows he is seeing something excellent and who does not want to diminish the excellence by reacting to it prematurely. Gideon Holt looked at the cattle. He looked at them the way a banker looks at assets, with the assessment that calculates value, and the value was visible. The value of 80 head of healthy cattle in good condition in March. The condition the evidence of management, and the management was Marit's, and the management was the qualification, and the qualification was standing in the street. Bring the cattle to the stockyard, Gideon said. Come to the bank on Monday. We will discuss the loan. We will not discuss the loan. We will sign the loan. The discussing was Tuesday. Tuesday was the no. Monday will be the yes. The yes is the signature on the loan document, and the signature will be mine, and the mineness is the thing you will accept, because the thing standing in your street proves that mineness is sufficient. Gideon went inside. The going inside was the retreat of a man whose policy had been overridden by evidence, and evidence is the thing that overrides policy when evidence is 80 head of cattle on a main street and the entire town is watching. Marit drove the herd to the stockyard. She drove them with the same skill she had driven them into town. The skill, the constancy, the proof that the driving in was not a stunt, but a demonstration of the daily reality of a woman who runs a cattle ranch. And the daily reality was the qualification, and the qualification was accepted. She signed the loan on Monday. She signed it with her name, Marit Sundersen. And the name was on the document, and the document was in the bank, and the bank was the Cattlemen's Bank of Ashton, and the Cattlemen's included a cattlewoman, and the including was the change, and the change was permanent. Orrin found her at the stockyard after the signing. He found her because he had been looking, and the looking was the thing he had been doing since Eric died. Looking at Marit, watching Marit, admiring Marit from the distance that respect requires. The distance that says I will not approach until the approaching is welcome, and welcome was the thing he was waiting for. You signed the loan, Orrin said. I signed the loan. I drove 80 head of cattle through town, and I signed the loan. And the signing was the victory, and the victory is not the money. The victory is the signature, and the signature is mine. I am glad. You told me to bring the herd. The telling was the strategy. The strategy was the idea. The idea was yours. The idea was mine. The execution was yours. The execution is the harder part. Anyone can have an idea. Not anyone can drive 80 head of cattle 7 miles alone down a mountain road and through a town and park them in front of a bank. The not anyone is you. The you is the thing I admire. Marit looked at Orrin. She looked at him from the saddle, and then she dismounted, and she looked at him from the ground. And the ground was level, and level is the position of equals, and equals is what they were. A cattlewoman and a cattle buyer. 2 people who understood cattle, and who understood competence, and who understood that competence is the quality that matters most. More than gender, more than policy, more than the walnut desk of a banker who says no. They stood in the stockyard while the March wind blew through the pen rails, the wind carrying the smell of cattle and dust and the particular cleanness of mountain air that has descended into a valley, the cleanness The freshness, the beginning. You drove 80 head alone, Oren said. Most men would need 3 riders for that distance through a town. You did it with 1 horse, and your voice, and the knowledge of how cattle move. And the knowledge is the thing I have watched for 4 years. And the watching has been the admiration, and the admiration has been the feeling. And the feeling is the thing I have not said, because not saying was the respect, and respect was the waiting. And the waiting is over, because today you proved that you do not need permission from anyone. And if you do not need permission from a banker, then you do not need permission from me. And the not needing is the reason I am speaking now. Would you like to ride out to the ranch? Marit said. I have 70 head arriving next week. I could use a second opinion on the placement. I would like that, Oren said. And the liking was the beginning. And the beginning was the ride. And the ride was the road up the mountain. And the mountain was the future. And the future was a cattlewoman and a cattle buyer riding side by side towards 600 acres in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos. And the side by side was the partnership. And the partnership was becoming something more.